Welcome to podcasts. While everyone was obsessing over Radiohead and Coldplay, an entire universe of progressive rock was thriving in complete obscurity. Bands with names like Arena and IQ were crafting 20-minute epics and concept albums that make OK Computer look like a pop single. Today, we're diving into the hidden world of Neo-Prog rock. Specifically, these underground British bands that kept the spirit of Genesis and Yes alive when everyone else gave up. By the end of this episode, you'll understand what Neo-Prog actually is and discover some of the most criminally underrated music ever made.
So let me throw this to you. Most people have never even heard the term Neo-Prog. What exactly are we talking about here?
Neo-progressive rock emerged in the early 1980s in the UK as basically a revival of classic progressive rock. According to Jerry Lucky's book, The Progressive Rock Files, this subgenre surfaced in late 1981, and he described it as having a bit more bite, a little more 80s feel compared to the original prog movement.
So this was happening right when punk was supposedly killing prog rock?
Exactly. The page content shows that prog's popularity declined after 1975 due to punk, but after 1980 it revived in this modernized form. Neo-Prog featured shorter songs, music that was easier on the ears, and greater social commitment than the original movement.
And the characteristics were pretty specific, right? This wasn't just any revival.
Right. According to Wikipedia, Neo-Prog is characterized by deeply emotional content, often delivered via dramatic lyrics and generous use of imagery and theatricality on stage. The music relied less on improvised jamming and more on careful composition.
So more structured, more emotional. And the guitar work?
Clean, melodic, and emotional electric guitar solos combined with keyboards. The main influences were first-wave prog bands like early Genesis, Camel, and to a lesser extent, Van der Graaf Generator and Pink Floyd. But they also drew from funk, hard rock, and punk.
That's fascinating. They were taking punk influences and somehow making them progressive. Now let's talk about IQ specifically. These guys seem to be at the center of this whole movement.
IQ is absolutely crucial. They were founded in 1981 by Mike Holmes and Martin Orford following the dissolution of their original band, The Lens. They're from Southampton, and they've been active continuously since then. They're still going as of 2025.
44 years, and most people have never heard of them. That's wild.
And here's what's really interesting. According to the progressive rock analysis I found, IQ represented Neo-Prog's structural conscience. While other bands like Marillion humanized prog for a new era, IQ hardened its structure.
What does that mean exactly, hardened its structure?
Where emotion and narrative took center stage in early Neo-Prog, IQ emphasized form, atmosphere, and compositional patience. They restored a sense of gravity that echoed classic prog without imitation. They didn't chase accessibility, they chose coherence, restraint, and long-form thinking.
So they were like the serious academics of the Neo-Prog world?
In a way, yes. The analysis describes them as preserving the architectural instincts of classic progressive rock, extended forms, thematic recurrence, atmospheric weight, while operating within a modern post-punk cultural landscape.
And they never achieved major commercial success, right? Despite all this musical sophistication.
Never. The Wikipedia entry specifically states they never enjoyed major commercial success and had several lineup changes, but they built up a loyal following over the years. They celebrated their 40th anniversary with concerts in the UK and Europe throughout 2021 and 2022.
There's something beautiful about that, 40 years of making uncompromising music for a devoted fan base. What about their key albums?
Their debut, Tales from the Lush Attic from 1983, captures their foundational approach, long-form compositions, atmospheric keyboards, disciplined pacing. But The Wake from 1985 is often considered their defining work.
The Wake was actually mentioned as one of the famous Neo-Prog albums alongside Marillion's Fugazi and Palace's The Sentinel, right?
Exactly. Jerry Lucky suggested Neo-Prog peaked in the mid-1980s, and The Wake was part of that peak moment. The analysis describes it as balancing accessibility with depth, showing IQ's ability to maintain intensity without overt drama.
Now, let's shift to Arena. This is a completely different story. They're basically a supergroup, right?
Arena is fascinating because they formed much later, 1995, and they really are a supergroup. According to Prog Archives, they gathered famous musicians, Mick Pointer from Marillion on drums, Clive Nolan from Pendragon on keyboards, and Keith Moore from Asia on guitar.
So these were established players coming together. That must have created some serious expectations.
And they delivered. Their debut, Songs from the Lion's Cage, was described as very professional progressive rock, close to Marillion but with hard rock elements. But here's what's interesting. Their sound actually gained heaviness after their first two albums.
Most bands go the opposite direction. They start heavy and get more accessible. Arena went heavier?
Right. The review notes that curiously, the band's sound gained in heaviness after their first two albums, and the music quality increased a lot in originality and musicianship. Their 1998 album, The Visitor, alternated passages inspired by Steve Hogarth's group with dark instrumentation.
And then they really hit their stride with the heavier material?
Absolutely. Immortal showed a new heavier dimension while remaining anchored in neo-progressive music. It featured an excellent 20-minute track called Moviedrome. Then Contagion followed that tradition, but was even more hard-edged and multi-dimensional.
A 20-minute track called Moviedrome, that's exactly the kind of thing that would never exist in mainstream music. What was Contagion about?
Contagion was a powerful concept album about the quest for redemption through the vision of a dark and anguishing future. The reviewer was so impressed, they said people wouldn't have to think long before electing it the best album of winter, 2002-2003.
And they kept evolving from there?
Their 2005 album, Pepper's Ghost, saw Arena entering the realms of quite heavy and very symphonic sound with metal elements. The review called it a real highlight of their career. AllMusic described them as one of the dominant neo-prog groups of the 1990s.
So we have IQ as the structural purists and Arena as the symphonic storytellers. But there's this whole ecosystem of obscure bands, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. The page content mentions bands like Jadis, which formed in 1982 and had connections to IQ. Their music was compared to IQ, but with a more upbeat and guitar-driven sound. They even opened for IQ at some point.
And there are Reddit discussions about underrated prog bands that need more attention. What did you find there?
There's a whole community seeking out these hidden gems. One post mentioned Night Area as a prog rock neo-prog band for people who like IQ, Marillion, and Genesis. Another mentioned Iluvatar for fans of Marillion, IQ, and ELP.
It's like there's this parallel universe where prog never died, it just went underground and got better. What about the really obscure stuff?
There's a fascinating forum discussion where someone was specifically seeking albums with 0 ratings to review. They mentioned being knowledgeable about prog metal and neo-prog, and other users started recommending incredibly obscure artists with names like Mark Shreve and Sergei Jokhanov.
0 ratings, meaning literally no one had bothered to rate these albums. That's obscurity on another level.
And according to Louder magazine, the definition of obscure in the prog world means that even a prog aficionado may not be able to claim knowledge of its existence. They featured 20 of the most obscure prog albums, some worth hefty prices.
So there's actual monetary value in this obscurity. These aren't just forgotten albums, they're collector's items.
Exactly. And Loudwire published a piece about 11 obscure prog albums that are just as good as the biggest classics. They argue these records warrant equal amounts of admiration, but are far less known because they're simply not championed.
That raises an interesting question. Why do these bands remain obscure? Is it just lack of marketing, or is there something about the music itself?
I think it's partly that neo-prog was always a niche within a niche. The page content shows that even Martin Orford from IQ was against the term neo-progressive and claimed they had wide-ranging eclectic influences rather than just copying older bands.
So there was resistance to being categorized even within the movement itself?
Right. And Paul Stump's History of Progressive Rock acknowledged that while IQ was derivative in its way, they gave the impression that their arrangements were indivisible from the notes played, that similarities with older bands arose accidentally from their personal approach.
That's actually a beautiful way to put it. The similarities arose accidentally from their personal approach. It suggests authenticity rather than imitation.
And that authenticity is probably why these bands have such devoted followings. IQ has been going for over 40 years with the same basic lineup. Arena continues to evolve and tour. These aren't nostalgia acts. They're living, breathing, creative entities.
There's something almost punk rock about that dedication to an uncompromising artistic vision, even if the music sounds nothing like punk.
That's a great observation. And remember, neo-prog did incorporate punk influences according to the Wikipedia entry. Maybe that DIY ethos, that commitment to doing things your own way regardless of commercial pressure, is part of what defines these bands.
You know what's fascinating? Peter Nichols from IQ also created the cover art for most of their albums. That's such a DIY approach. The vocalist is also the visual artist.
That perfectly captures the spirit of these bands. They're not just musicians, they're complete artistic entities. Everything from the 20-minute compositions to the album artwork comes from within the band itself.
And Arena's Moviedrome being 20 minutes long, that's the kind of epic composition that mainstream music completely abandoned. These bands kept that tradition alive.
Exactly. While everyone else was chasing 3-minute radio singles, these bands were crafting musical journeys. They preserved something essential about what rock music could be when it wasn't constrained by commercial formats.
So when you step back from all this, what's the bigger picture here? Why should people care about these obscure neo-prog bands?
These bands represent something crucial. They prove that artistic integrity and creative ambition can survive and thrive outside the mainstream. They've created a parallel universe where complexity, emotion, and craftsmanship still matter.
And they're still out there, still making music, still finding audiences. IQ celebrated their 40th anniversary just a couple years ago. Arena is still active. This isn't just history, it's happening right now.
Right. And for anyone feeling overwhelmed by the disposable nature of modern music, these bands offer something different. Depth, permanence, music that rewards repeated listening and reveals new layers over time.
Here's what I find most compelling. These bands created their own ecosystem. They don't need mainstream validation because they've built something sustainable on their own terms. That's actually revolutionary.
And that ecosystem is still growing. Those Reddit discussions, those forum posts seeking out zero-rated albums, there's a whole community of people discovering and championing this music. The obscurity is part of the appeal.
So if someone wanted to dive into this world, where would you tell them to start?
Start with IQ's The Wake and Arena's Contagion. Those albums capture what makes Neo-Prog special. The structural sophistication, the emotional depth, the willingness to take time and space to develop ideas properly.
And then just follow the rabbit hole from there. Check out those forum discussions, explore the connections between bands, discover your own hidden gems.
Exactly. Because that's what this music is really about. Discovery, exploration, the joy of finding something that speaks to you that nobody else knows about. It's the opposite of algorithmic recommendation culture.
Perfect. And with that, thanks for joining us on Podcasts. Remember, while everyone else was following the crowd, bands like Arena and IQ were quietly creating some of the most sophisticated and emotionally powerful music ever made. The next time someone tells you rock is dead, you'll know exactly where to point them.